All right, welcome back, U.S. history students. We just looked at all the terrible things that are happening during the Great Depression as I'm sitting here eating my lunch, munching on some delicious Hoover stew. And we saw all the things that are happening during the Great Depression. And we talked a little about who Hoover was. Wow, that's a mouthful. About who Herbert Hoover was and his response to the Great Depression. And we're going to see whether he was able to stop all these terrible things that are happening. The president is tasked with solving the issues in our country, and we're going to see whether he was able to do it or not. So remember the Hawley Smoot tariff. One of the first things that Hoover does in order to stop the Great Depression, try and reverse it, making sure that American citizens are buying American-made goods. Again, totally backfires. 2/3 of all world trade completely falls apart. That is a lot of money that was formerly exchanging hands between countries that is no longer in place. Gone. It makes foreign countries mad at the United States and makes the United States not want to play nice with foreign countries. Makes the Great Depression even worse and really makes it go worldwide beyond the borders of the United States. And we see that Herbert Hoover's name gets attached to a lot of negative things. You ate your delicious Herbert Hoover stew, your Hoover stew in class. People cobbled together as many ingredients as they could, toss them in a pot. That's Hoover stew. Hoovervilles are these shanty towns that are popping up all over the country outside of cities. People just putting together a shack made out of whatever materials they had, and that's what they lived in when their houses were gone or they couldn't pay their rent for their apartments. Hoovervilles. There's another example of a Hooverville. Look at the sign here. Hard times are still hoovering over us, that we are blaming Herbert Hoover for many of the problems here in the United States. He's supposed to solve them as president. A Hoover wagon. Remove the engine out of your broken down car that you can't afford to fix. Attach a horse. There's your transportation. Hoover blanket. Can't afford a blanket. Can't afford a bed to sleep on. No problem. We have newspapers. That is a Hoover blanket. Something to lay on or cover yourself up with at night when you are out on the streets because you do not have a home. Hoover flag, turn your pockets inside out. That's the universal sign for I have no money. That's called a Hoover flag, turning your pockets inside out. Hoover hogs, we can't afford those fancy meats like beef and pork and chicken, but we can sure eat some rabbits like we saw in the Dust Bowl. That is what we call a Hoover hog. Rabbits, how many of you had rabbit before? Probably not too many. I don't imagine that would be too appetizing. And we have Hoover shoes. Shoes that are basically bits and pieces of cardboard, bits and pieces of cloth, anything that can be cobbled together, bits and pieces of leather to form some sort of shoes. Doesn't look very comfortable or being protective of your feet. The year 1932 was not a good year for Herbert Hoover. In fact, I challenge you to find somebody who had a worse year, somebody who stayed alive, that didn't die. But very few people have had a worse year than 1932 for Herbert Hoover. It all starts with something called the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. So the government tries to enact a program, and this is Herbert Hoover's idea, that we need to lower the mortgage rates for homeowners and also for farmers so they can pay back their loans and they don't lose their houses. But Herbert Hoover is a very, very conservative person. He's elected to continue on 1920s conservatism. He doesn't believe that the government should have to do a whole lot for people, that the Great Depression is just going to work itself out. And if you can't deal with it, then tough. It says it may not be perfect, but it'll sure help quite a bit, telling the farmer that, this is the best I can do. Government shouldn't be involved in these things. You kind of need to deal with it on your own. But obviously hard times are still upon us here, signified by these birds. And this act doesn't even really do anything until Hoover is voted out of office. Second thing he did was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He authorized $2 billion in money to be given to banks, insurance companies, railroads, and other large businesses. Money that they could use to kind of keep themselves going and stay afloat. This is very anti-conservative. Herbert Hoover doesn't like the idea, which is why it doesn't go above $2 billion. But the thought is that we'd experience something in this country called trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics, let me reload here, is the thought that if you give money to the people at the top, these business owners and these large industries, it's going to trickle down to the people that are working under them. So if you keep the railroads and these other large companies that employ a lot of people, if you keep them going, that money is going to work its way down to the individuals at the bottom. the majority of people, the hardworking Americans. As you can see, though, by this cartoon, that money dries up pretty quickly. That idea of trickle-down economics, it doesn't work as well as it would seem to in theory. And also, $2 billion is just simply not enough for the American economy to reboot itself. That's just simply not enough money. Herbert Hoover doesn't really want the government involved in things. He's conservative. So this $2 billion is really too little money and too late. We saw this happen in 2008 when the government bails out the auto industry and the big banks. You may remember a bit of that from when you were a kid. This is the first time the government's ever done something like this. Something called the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, which isn't even passed when Herbert Hoover is president, but it begins to define his presidency. And we're going to talk about it in very big detail tomorrow. It's going to be kind of the subject of everything. The basics of it are this. In 1924, a law was passed. This is the law up here, and it said that the law said that World War I veterans would be paid money in 1945. So years after World War I had ended, they would be paid a bonus up to $625 based on their service, which is a lot of money, basically as a reward for thank you for your service to this country. But that money wasn't going to be given until 1945. Well, times are tough across the United States. It's 1932. We're in the depths of the Depression. And many veterans around the country who have lost their jobs are like, hey, can we get this money now? Because we really need it. We don't need it in 1945, and I may not even be alive then. I want this money now. Please give it to me. And that becomes kind of the defining moment of Herbert Hoover's presidency, as we're going to see tomorrow. What he does in making a decision of whether to pay this bonus or not. So Herbert Hoover has all these problems. He's getting blamed for everything. Nasty things are being named after him. So he tries to blame others. He tries to shift blame in the United States towards another group of people. He tries to shift it towards Mexican American citizens. Again, I said citizens, not illegal immigrants. Herbert Hoover tries to divert attention away from his administration and the problems by blaming unskilled Mexican workers, basically like coal miners or people working in factories, as the cause of the Great Depression, and he begins deporting them back to Mexico. Again, these are not illegal immigrants. These are American citizens that have the same rights as you and me and every other American. And his administration basically tells these people to get out, and he sends police forces out to round them up and send them back to Mexico. American citizens having their civil liberties trampled upon, sent out of our country, no justification whatsoever. This also makes him look very bad. Imagine if President Obama just starts rounding up a bunch of, let's say, Canadian Americans, people that immigrated from Canada and are American citizens, and says, go back to Canada, we don't want you here, you're causing problems. That makes a president look pretty bad. Now, one enduring legacy of Herbert Hoover's is the Hoover Dam, which you guys don't really need to know a whole lot about. Construction starts on it in 1928. Before the crash, it's finished by 1936, and they name it after Herbert Hoover. It's really the only thing positive that we can attribute to his presidency. It provides a lot of electricity. It's kind of a big engineering feat like the Panama Canal, but for the most part, we don't really care about the Hoover Dam. And that's all I have for you guys today. So make sure you have some notes on that for class tomorrow. And we're going to focus specifically on that World War Adjustment Act and really whether or not the bonus should have been paid to these World War I veterans.